Hartford Baptist Church, and welcome to episode 5 of our study in Galatians. We have now reached chapter 2. If you recall from our previous lesson, Paul is justifying his ministry. He let the church of Galatia know that the gospel he was preaching, he got directly from Jesus Christ. It did not come from another man. That there's what Paul got firsthand knowledge of that gospel from Jesus himself. And Paul continues to, be on the defense a little bit. He is showing his street cred, if you will, to the church of Galatia. And we'll go ahead and jump in verse 1 here of chapter 2. We're probably going to go to verse 8, I think, so I'm going to try to get to today. And so if you want to read ahead and read before I start talking, go ahead and pause it now. Read verses 1 through 8. And if you are ready to go, we will hit it right now. Starting in verse 1, Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. Yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Verse 6, And from those who seemed to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential add nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been trusted to the gospel to the circumcised, for he worked with, let me start verse 8 over. For he worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised, worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. All right, going back up to verse 1 here. So we start back. Then after 14 years, we shouldn't look at this as 14 years after his return from the Arabian exile, if you want to call it that. This is still probably referring, just like the 3 years mentioned in last week's lesson, referring to Paul's conversion, the Damascus Road. So 14 years after the Damascus Road, Paul makes a second trip to Jerusalem with Barnabas and taking along Titus. Who are these guys, Barnabas and Titus? Some of you may know who, but we're going to go ahead and talk about them briefly anyways. Barnabas, as we've seen in the book of Acts, Barnabas' name was actually Joseph. Joseph was a very common name. In order to kind of set him apart for the others, he was given the name Barnabas. He was if you read the book of Acts, Barnabas is all over it almost as much as Paul, maybe even more than Peter. Barnabas is a main character in the book of Acts. He was a Levite. He vouched for Paul's conversion to the apostles, and was a missionary alongside of Paul for a while. Huge in establishing the early church. Titus was most likely a younger man, a guy who Paul calls his spiritual child, much like Timothy. Titus is believed to be one of Paul's spiritual converts out of Antioch in Syria. And Titus kind of tagged along with Paul. We see from Titus chapter 1, verse 5, that Titus seemed to be the elder or the bishop of the church in Crete. That verse is why church history looks back and calls Titus the first bishop of Crete. He was a church leader trained by and converted by Paul. But both of these individuals went with him on this second trip to Jerusalem. And going into, screen went black on us there. He goes, he receives a revelation, and he goes, which is most likely from God, or something in his spirit compelling him to go to Jerusalem. And he goes and he presents the gospel to, which the ESV says, those who seemed influential. I don't really like how that's worded compared to the Greek there. The NET in the middle column is a little better, meeting with the influential people. The ESV makes it sound like that they may not be. When I read the words, those who seemed influential, like they might be, I'm not sure. The NET is more matter of fact that they are influential. We'll switch over to the CSB here real quick and see what it says. Those recognized as leaders. That's a good rendering there. They are recognized as leaders. Skipping ahead a little bit to verse 9, which we'll go ahead and down look at that. It's not actually part of our passage today, but we'll look at it. The people he spoke to, James, Cephas, and John, those recognized as pillars. They are recognized just not by Paul, but they are recognized by the early church as pillars of that early church. And that's what Paul in verse 2, he's going to establish those who have approved his teaching. These respected leaders of the church, these are the ones who are approving what I am saying. And then he goes on to say that. He goes, I told them the gospel that I proclaimed to the Gentiles in order to make sure I wasn't messing something up, to make sure I was not running in vain. But then he goes on kind of in the middle of this discussion and says, you know what? And I had a guy named Titus with me, and Titus wasn't circumcised, nor did they force him to be circumcised. Even though he was a Greek, it was never brought up, as it seemed. And Paul's going to use, this is going to be important. This is going to set the groundwork for what the big issue was in Galatians. And it's going to revolve around circumcision in the law. Paul's going to be much more clear and aggressive as we progress through, especially by the time we hit chapter 5. But circumcision played a major issue in the early church. And Paul's making a point here that not even Peter, James, and John required Titus to be circumcised. So why are these other teachers saying that the Gentiles, the Greeks, have to be circumcised when not even Peter and John and James did so? Then he goes on to say in verse 4, yet because of these false brothers secretly brought in, it says they slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Jesus Christ so they might bring us into slavery. Well, that we're going to kind of park verse 4 for a little bit because Paul's going to explain this to us later on. And I'm going to be patient, let him do that to us, but he's going to tell us how those Jewish Christians seeked to enslave the Gentile Christians. And it's not actually slave labor, so I don't even be thinking about that, but we'll let Paul explain that later in the letter. But this is important here. To them, we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. This is an important issue. Paul mentioned Barnabas earlier, and many of you know Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement, and they split. It wasn't about the gospel. It wasn't about the need to do ministry. It was about like how to do ministry, like what ministry do we want to do? Who do we need with us? Where do we want to do it? It was that ideopher, that it's not really important to the church. I mean, it's still important, but it's not something to die on a mountain for. Paul and Barnabas went separate ways. God was certainly blessed because now he's got 2 missionary teams out there. And if we look at like passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6, Paul seems to be friends with Barnabas after this split. And to kind of give us a modern example of, and I hate to use the word split, but just different people doing different ministries. In Hartford Baptist, we have 2 women's groups. One is Women on Purpose, the other one Women on Mission. Women on Mission is heavy in WMU, heavy in missions, as their name suggests, raising money for missions. They are in the ministry of missions. They want to spread that gospel. They want to fundraise to pay for missionaries. They feel that's a high calling, and certainly that's a biblical calling. Women on Purpose focuses more so on female discipleship, also another biblical calling. Well, not everyone in our WOM and our Women in Purpose are in the other group. Some mix, some do both, but others don't, and that's okay. If some feel that this is more important to focus on missions, and if some feel it's more important to focus on discipleship, Well, let's do both. Let's have two groups. Let's have a Barnabas group and a Paul group, and let's do both. We can bless the community in multiple ways. There's nothing wrong with having two groups as long as they don't oppose each other, and they don't. We have a very healthy women's groups in our church. But that's just an example of how that works in the modern church. But where Paul does draw the line in verse 5, where he says, we do not yield in submission even for a moment. And kind of a modern phrase, don't give him an inch. And that's when the gospel is at stake. This would be, and Paul's going to set this throughout the rest of it, where he's going to talk about how false teachings are adding to the gospel. How it fundamental, which we've seen it earlier, we already seen it, where they seek to distort, to pervert, to change the very substance of the gospel. That's where Paul draws that line. You don't compromise that line. When it comes to doing ministry and the aspects of ministry and the styles of ministry, yeah, you can compromise there. Paul and Barnabas did that. But when it comes to the truth of the gospel, you don't give an inch. And Paul didn't give an inch. He's not going to give an inch. And likewise, we need to be that way in the church. And Paul's going to expand on that throughout this letter, and we're just going to naturally let him do that. Verse 6, and from those who seem to be influential, again, he's referring back to Peter, James, and John. And then he kind of makes this statement that just seems kind of odd. What they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those who I say seem to be influential added nothing to me. What I think Paul is trying to convey here is what we do in ordination at the local church as well. The ordination with the local church says we confirm God's calling. And certainly John and Peter and James confirmed Paul's teaching. They did not give Paul that teaching. They did not give Paul a commission. They confirmed his commission. They gave him his seal of approval so the rest of the church can recognize Paul as being legit. And that's what we do in ordination in the modern church. We confirm somebody's calling by God. We say, yep, as far as we can tell, they are legit. And that's what Paul is saying that they did. They didn't really add anything to him, but they just confirmed what he is saying, and they confirmed his calling to be that apostle to the Gentiles. Which, we're running a little bit long here. Of course, verse 7, on the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel, and that they confirm him. That's what these last two verses that we read are talking about. Paul is confirmed for ministry. And I think we're going to wrap it up there because we went long on time, and I don't want to make a single episode too long. But next go around, we will pick up in verse 9, and I'll see you next time.